Good morning, or good afternoon, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. Please, a quick reminder to stay muted, and welcome to the CCMAR Seminars, and thank you for attending. Today we have Felipe Carvalho, who is currently a PhD from Virginia Tech, and he'll be speaking on how different gear types selected for distinct functional traits affect the catch rates of coral fish in northeastern Brazil. And you can share your screen now and go ahead. Thank you for joining us, Felipe.
Thank you, Monica. Yes. Can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Let me put on presentation mode, see if it's all working properly. All right, perfect. Yeah, thank you, Monica, so much for the invite. It's a great pleasure to be here talking to you today, to all of you at the University of Algarve. Boa tarde. And I'm Felipe Carvalho. I'll be presenting 2 chapters of my dissertation. I'm actually finishing my PhD next week, so I'm pretty excited about that. I'll be defending next Thursday. And today's presentation and my dissertation's title is Effects of Fishing on a Coral Reef Fish Assemblage in Northeast Brazil. Starting off with a quick introduction on coral reef ecosystems, we all know it's one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. Over 25% of marine fish species inhabit these ecosystems, although they cover less than 1% of the ocean basin. And of course, they sustain the livelihoods of millions of people worldwide. Current estimates on the number of fishers reveal 6 million fishers in tropical regions, directly depending on this activity. However, coral reefs are under threat by overfishing. Over half of all the reefs in the world, they are threatened by overfishing. And it affects fish biomass, the overall size structure of fish communities, as well as changes to species and trait diversity. Related to that, many fishing gears are used to maximize exploitation of the different species of coral reefs. In our study area, for example, in Brazil, there are 9 main gear types that are used. And the knowledge gap that I'll be addressing today is that very few studies have actually assessed the specific impacts of each gear type on the fish assemblage. And that's because tropical countries, they are under a data poor scenario. So Brazil, for example, we lacked the financial and human resources for fisheries monitoring and management. There has been several years in Brazil that we don't have a nationwide statistics reports. I think the last year was 2012. So we simply don't know how much we are producing in our waters, how much fish we are taking out of them. And as I mentioned before, most of previous studies, they have used aggregated levels of catching effort across gear types. So far from ideal. My first overarching research question is, how do gears select fishes in terms of their functional traits? And this figure from Embaru and collaborators, research that was published 2 years ago, shows us that coral reef fishes, they display a high diversity of traits. So here we have, for example, body size, schooling behavior, mobility, diet, period of activity, different traits exhibited by coral reef fishes. And what the authors found in this PCOA is that the different gear types, they select for fish with similar traits. So for example, these colored areas shown what is the portion of the assemblage function that is selected by gill nets and beach seines. And what we can see is that is a similar portion of the assemblage that's being selected not only by these gears, but other gears as well, such as hook and line and traps that are used in Kenya in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean. However, this study proposed that these patterns of overlap in trait selectivity, they occur everywhere in the world, but we do know that there are strong regional differences in the composition of functional traits. These differences are due to natural variation in traits as well as fishing impacts. We expect that Kenya in the Indian Ocean is more overfished than other areas such as Brazil, for example, and the fishing effects will definitely affect the composition of traits and the diversity. So this begs the question, how do gears select fish in terms of their functional traits in other regions in the globe? So our study area is located in northeastern Brazil, at the Marine Protected Area Coast of Corals, which is the largest MPA in Brazil, encompassing 400,000 hectares and 12 municipalities. We call Costa dos Corais, Marine Protected Area Costa dos Corais. And there's a high biodiversity of species. Over 200 coral reef fishes are found in the area, and 100 of these species, they are frequently harvested. As I mentioned, the MPA encompasses 12 municipalities with several fishing communities and over 8,000 fishers. And although it is considered an MPA, there are actually few management restrictions in the area. So it's pretty much like an open access. The few management restrictions we have, it's some no-take zones. One of them has been implemented over 20 years ago. So this one's pretty good, but others are just recent. And now the government are also trying to push for some fishing gear restrictions. But for the most part, is open access. And in our data collection, we sampled 2 habitat types. So coral reefs here are represented by these green areas. You can see the different names there in Portuguese. And 4 gear types are used on the reefs: diving, so harpoons, hook and line, hook for octopus, and lobster gill net. In lagoons, those shallow areas between the coral reefs and the coast, we have 5 gear types: beach seines, cast net, corals, gill net, and seine net. So our data collection first involved assessing fishing effort. First thing we did when we arrived at the landing sites was to use binoculars to count the number of fishers, to identify the gear types as well. And then we just sit there and wait for the fishermen to come back from their activities. Oops, sorry. Once fishermen was landing, we interviewed them, we approached, and we asked permission to first weigh their production, so obtaining the catch in kilograms for each of the species, as well as assessing the size structure of the catch. Our first specific question is, are there direct associations between gears and functional traits? And we found diverse patterns of selectivity of traits across gears. So here I'm showing a principal components analysis with the different traits, as such as Embaru did in the previous slide. I shown as well those traits and the different gears. So for example, mobility we see in the bottom of the PCA. Sedentary and mobile species are closely associated to gears such as cast nets, diving, and hook and line. In contrast, in the top of the PCA, very mobile species are more closely associated to coral and gill net with a large mesh size. Now, positioning the water column in the right side of the PCA, we can see the benthic species are closely associated to octopus hook and lobster gill net, whereas bentopelagic species, again, more closely associated to cast nets, diving, hook and line, and pelagic species on the left, far left side, associated to coral and other gears used in the lagoons as well, such as gill nets. Our second research question, what is the overall diversity of traits exploited by each fishing gear? We found that those gears that are used on reefs, they are more selective than those used on coastal lagoons. This is our representation of a principal coordinate analysis. For example, position in the water column varying from left to right, from benthic to pelagic species. Schooling behavior varying from solitary species on the top left to species that form larger schools on the bottom right. We can also see how diet varies, period of activity, and mobility from left to side, from sedentary to very mobile species. So here I show same PCOA, same principal coordinate analysis for the gears used on coral reef habitats. And we can see that hook and line and diving, they are pretty selective, they're very selective. So their functional volumes, for example, represented here in the bottom left of each plot. For hook and line is only 11%. So about 11% of the whole assemblage function is being selected by hook and line, whereas for diving is 18%. And we can see that they are more displaced to the left of the PCOA. So again, more closely related to benthic and bentopelagic species, as well those species that are not very mobile and that they don't exhibit large schools. Lobster, gillnet, and octopus hook, those are species-specific gears. So you can see the functional volume here is non-applicable because they really target an insignificant portion of the assemblage function. In contrast, when we take a look at the plots for the gears used on coastal lagoons, we see that those gears, they harvest a much larger portion of the assemblage function. For example, gillnet used with fine mesh size, they target a functional volume of 38%. So those those gears, they harvest a much larger portion of the assemblage function. For our third and final research question, what is the degree of overlap in trait selectivity across gear type? So our results indicate a low degree of overlap between pairs of gears. About 25% of functional volume was shared by pairs of gears. I don't want you to worry or read this table, but this is just to show that, for example, cast nets, they were the gear that had a more unique selectivity. Only about 10% of the assemblage function was shared between cast nets and any other gear. So to the best of our knowledge, our study is the first to assess differences in trait selectivity between different habitat types. And we found that gears used on coral reefs, they select for sedentary bentopelagic species that forms schools with few individuals. In contrast, coastal lagoons, they select for very mobile pelagic species that form large schools. And interestingly, we also found a very low overlap in trait selectivity across gear types with regards to functional traits. So this graph, I compare the percent of shared species, functional entities. So functional entities here is simply a group of species that share the exact same functional traits. And I also show the shared functional volume across all gear types and pairwise, 2 pairs of gears. And we can see that overall in Brazil, there's a lower overlap than the study that I was talking before of Embaru and collaborators in Kenya. So this indicates that the different gears in Brazil, they don't compete as much for the same traits or resources as in Kenya. And the reason why we think that is because in Brazil, there was a more heterogeneous composition of traits. So for example, in Kenya, we can see that for each of the traits, for example, position in the water column or period of activity, mobility, there was a dominant trait that about 80% of the assemblage that was exploited exhibit that trait. In Brazil, no, we can see that the shape of the histogram was much more even. So there was a larger diversity of traits there. And there are probably 2 main reasons for this. One is habitat. So in Brazil, it's a very particular habitat because the coral cover is actually very low there. So we actually found more pelagic species than benthic species. In Kenya, no, the coral cover there is greater. So the benthic individuals, they dominate the assemblage, right? And the second reason for this, besides habitat, is fishing, as I mentioned before. We expect that Kenya, the assemblage is more overexploited, and this can definitely influence how the traits distributions and how there is this domination of traits there. So in Brazil, because it's probably less overfished, we found a greater diversity of traits. Now I'm actually going to jump into my second chapter of the dissertation, and the overarching research question is, are some gear types more detrimental to fish catch rates than others? So previous research, such as Lorenzen and collaborators 2006, they found that fishing efforts decreases the catch rates, which is a good proxy for abundance of tropical fish assemblages. We can see that as effort initially increases, there's a sharp decrease in catch rates, followed by a local maximum at intermediate levels of fishing effort as fishers start exploiting more productive resources. And then catch rates continually decreases for higher levels of effort. However, these patterns occurs for aggregated levels of effort and catch across gear types. Again, no studies have assessed the specific impacts of each gear type. So this begs the question, are some gear types more detrimental to fish catch rates than others? For this chapter, our methods involved first estimating catch rates, which we did as kilograms divided by hours fishing. We log transformed both effort levels and catch rates to account for non-normality. And then we estimated daily averages of catch and effort for a given gear and location or fishing ground. We had to do that because we didn't register fishers' names or IDs during the interviews, so we could not treat each observation independently. If we treated each observation independently, our estimates of variance would be biased and small, so that would result in type 1 error. So then we were forced to estimate those daily averages of catch and effort. We didn't simply collect their names because they would associate our research with surveillance. They would not want to participate. We then ran linear mixed models in our using catch rate as our response variable, and then 4 potential explanatory variables such as fishing effort, month to account for seasonal variation, tide height, which influences catchability, distance to river, which will influence species composition and abundance, region to account for potential differences across locations. We have 3 main regions, north, center, and south, across the marine protected area. And finally, we set fishing ground as a random effect to allow for the intercept of effort on catch rates to vary randomly by fishing ground. So this is our global model. We use the function in our dredge to obtain all possible models. And then we selected only the best models with AIC lower than 4 to make a final average model to obtain our parameter estimates for each of the explanatory variables. Our first approach was same as everybody does in the literature. So just aggregating efforts of, levels of effort and catch across all gear types. So this is the output of our model considering all gears from both habitats and all the gear types. And we can see the explanatory variables here: fishing effort, tide height, distance to river, region, and month. And as expected, we found the negative effect of effort on catch rate. So basically, the blue lines represent those variables that were significant because the confidence interval does not cross 0. And the red lines represent those variables that are non-significant because confidence intervals crossing 0 here. Our second approach was to analyze both habitat types, coral reefs and lagoons. And then we found that fishing effort on the reefs had a negative effect on catch rates, but not really for coastal lagoons. Finally, we assessed catch and effort for each gear type. So here first I show for the gears used on coral reefs. Hook and line was the only gear that had a negative effect of effort on catch rates. The other 3 gears, octopus, lobster, and diving, did not. And for the gears used on coastal lagoons, only cast nets and gill nets had a negative effect of effort on catch rates. As a final analysis, we actually ran linear mixed models for each of the main species that are harvested in the study area. So on the y-axis, we have the parameter estimates of slope of effort on catch rates. And on the x-axis, we computed the index of vulnerability proposed by Cheung and collaborators, 2005. The index of vulnerability takes into account the different life history traits, such as size, longevity, age of maturity, and growth. And we can see, for example, mudgill, the mullets, a tainha, as we call in Brazil, is one of the species that has highest index of vulnerability and one of the species that was more negatively affected by fishing. In contrast, sardines here on the left side, one of the lowest index of vulnerability, so very resilient species. And then we found actually positive parameter estimates of effort on catch rates, indicating that fishing did not negatively affect the species. Wrapping up the presentation. So the effects of fishing depended on habitat, being more detrimental on reefs than on lagoons. On coral reef habitats, one of the reasons we think that is because the exploited species, they are highly vulnerable, such as the parrotfishes, the Sparaxoma axillari, or the grouper Epinephelus ascensionis. These are protogynous species, so all of the individuals are born female, some of them become male, and then if the fishing pressure is too high, there will be not enough male to fertilize those eggs. In contrast, in coastal lagoons, most of the resources, they exhibit faster growth and larger home ranges, such as sardines. So those resources are more resilient to fishing. Fishing effects depend not only on the habitat, but also on the gear. And our results indicate that the index of vulnerability is a very good proxy for determining the effects of fishing. Again, hook and line, for example, selected for those vulnerable species, such as the grouper, Epinephelus ascensionis. And we actually found some gears that are used on coastal lagoons that did have a negative effect on catch rates. And gill nets and cast nets, for example, they do target the mullets, which is one of the most vulnerable species in our study area because they display high longevity, slow population growth, and schooling behavior. So the populations will be vulnerable to fishing gears, even with low abundances. Implications for management, of course, this depends on the goals defined by the different stakeholders. So if the goal is to conserve coral reef vulnerable species, then the key here is to cap the effort levels to avoid localized overexploitations on the gears used on coral reefs. However, if the goal is to conserve biodiversity, then effort for non-selective gears used on lagoons should be limited. This is my final slide, so only the take-home messages here. Fishing on coral reef select for sedentary, bentopelagic, and vulnerable species, whereas fishing on coastal lagoons select for very mobile pelagic species that are resilient. Management institutions should focus on identifying species with high vulnerability index, and we need some very holistic research that is here to detail the complex impacts occurring to overexploited tropical fish assemblages. I'd just like to thank my funding, so from Bruford Small Grants and Lavazza Coffee, as well as the Department of Fish and Wildlife at Virginia Tech, and your attention for today's presentation, as well as the invite for being here today in the seminar series. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Felipe. So now it's open to questions. You can just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask Felipe.
And I'm sorry about the background noise here. There's a gardener just next door. Oops. Should I stop sharing my screen or?
You can keep it up if
All right.
someone might have a question regarding the presentation. You can.
All right. I'll keep on presentation mode so I can better manage this.
I guess I can ask a question then. Do you have any sense of how the fishers in this location would react if stakeholders were to cap their catch rates or set different types of quotas?
Yeah, I think that in our study area, fishermen are very, in general, right? They are very skeptical of management overall, of conservation initiatives, especially those that would directly either like cap effort or actually be more abrupt or just like restrict the gears. But there are some initiatives in the area, as I mentioned before, on determining and defining no-take zones. And with that, I think fishermen was pretty open to it. They were fine. They said, yeah, let's set these locations for protection, and that was good. That was already a good step. So it's definitely tricky. It's never easy with management having these decisions made. Fishermen will not like it, but if they can see the potential benefits, then I think it's good. And one thing that I didn't mention, the fishing on coral reefs with the 4 different gear types is actually very detrimental to the structure of the reefs, because fishermen will walk on the top of the reefs while conducting their activities. So I'm sure there would be lots of benefits if CAP efforts are reduced.
And has anyone talked to them about maybe not walking on the coral?
Yeah, the way it's tricky. The study area, it's very unique, and there are alternatives, of course, but most of the fishermen, they don't really have a boat. They will walk in the low tide from the beach to the reef, and when they get there, it's just like they will walk on top of the reef as well. It definitely degrades the structure, but as I mentioned, the coral cover there is very low and has been historically low, like since the 50s, the 60s, it's been low. And it's a unique type of reef in the sense that for sure it degrades, but it's not as in other areas that the reef is as sensitive.
Any other questions? Like I said, you can just unmute yourself. I guess you're not gonna get fired with questions. That's for next week, huh?
It's all good. Yeah,
Okay.
I left my email here in the last slide. So it's just fmc@vt.edu. So yeah, if any other question pop up, just write me an email and I'll be happy to exchange ideas.
Great. Well, thank you so much for presenting, and thank you everyone for attending. As always, remember to keep an eye out on your emails to see what next seminar is going to happen, and good luck on your defense and good luck on job prospects. So thank you again for presenting.
Yes, thank you so much for the invite again. It was a great pleasure to be here in the University of Algarve today presenting to you all. Good luck for all of you as well in the PhD and the reverse. And I hope to see you in the future. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.